On today's World Insight, China's carbon trading market celebrates its first-year anniversary. Does China's carbon market need tweaking as it races to carbon neutrality?
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. Carbon markets have become very popular as a tool to rein in industrial pollution in recent years. Under a typical carbon market, a central authority grants emissions permits to enterprises, which limits the amount of carbon dioxide a company may produce. Enterprises that are short of permits can buy them from the market through a carbon price system that is crucial to cutting emissions cost effectively. China's national carbon trading market started on July the 16th, 2021, marking a significant shift from a command and control policy to a market-based approach. The carbon market is seen to play a key role in achieving China's carbon peaking and carbon neutrality goals. After a year in operation, what has China's carbon market achieved so far? The lessons and experiences, and what's for the future? Cooperation with the others? Let's loop in our panelists. In Durham, Jackson Owen, Senior Fellow at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions from Duke University. In Boston, Michael Melling, Deputy Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In Washington, D.C., Wu Changhua, China Director of the Office of Jeremy Rifkin. Last but not least, in Beijing, Zhang Jianyu, Executive Director of BRI Green Development Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. Congratulations, I should say, 1 year to the carbon market in China, because every one of you over the past years have been contributing to that. So a big congratulations to every one of you. Having said that, though, I know, Mr. Zhang, you are in Wuhan in one of those celebrations of this 1 year anniversary. This is a big thing in China. Tell me more about how people are, assess the achievements so far.
I think the most remarkable thing is, given all the uncertainties and given all the disturbance in the world, that China is still able not only to pull this through, to launch the market on July the 16th of last year, was able to operate it in a way as smoothly as possible, and to have the market operational and to start to be functional. I think that itself is very remarkable.
Functional, operational, that's the word you seem to give in terms of more the state of things right now. Let me go to you, Mr. Melling. How do you compare the size and the focus of China's carbon market to some of the others you've seen around the world?
I think it's great that you have a 1 year celebration. I cannot remember that Europe, say, had that after 1 year of the EU ETS, which would have been in 2006. The Chinese one is, as Dr. Zhang has said, it's the largest, simply by the sheer scale of the power sector that is covered by this ETS in China, compared to the EU ETS, which has now become the second largest after being the largest for the first 15 years. There are some differences in the technical design. Perhaps most importantly, the cap, of course. It is an absolute cap in the European one, for instance, also in the other emissions trading systems like California, RGGI. And the Chinese one is intensity-based, so it does leave some breathing room for continued growth. But other than that, it's a very familiar system, and the approach, the basic principles, the incentives that result, these are very familiar for anybody who's worked with emissions trading systems.
There are a lot of things going on in the world these days about, the rise again of fossil fuel is one of it. So how do you see, Mr. Owen, about these latest development vis-a-vis the states of the carbon markets around the world?
I think your question about energy resources is a particularly important one in China and everywhere at present. In China's case, the energy crises of late 2021 has understandably put energy security front and center in the minds of Chinese citizens and regulators. And as such, there, I think, is going to continue to be a prioritization on ensuring the provision of power to industries, households, and otherwise, even as the system continues to evolve through bringing on more alternative energies such as solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, and other potential emergent non-fossil sources that may come in the future. For the ETS, that will mean a number of critical questions will need to be answered. One, will the intensity-based benchmarks that Dr. Mailing just referenced become stricter in the future to perhaps accelerate the move from that fossil fuel energy towards those other sources? Will other forms of energy, including that which is fueling energy, be brought into the system and across what timeframes? And how will China continue to balance those energy security needs with the need to transform its system to be more environmentally sound?
Let me also ask you, Ms. Wu, regarding the rise of fossil fuels. We see that in China, following, as Mr. Wu said, 2021, but we also see as a result of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, for example. So how do you see all these latest events are going to have an impact on the nature, speed, and scale of carbon markets around the world?
We definitely feel the impact already. And as we're discussing here today, the world around us is becoming so complicated and complexing with multiple challenges at the same time, challenging literally the core of the question about decarbonization, how fast we can go at this moment, not only for China, but for Europe, North America's other major economies as well. Energy security has become absolute #1 priority, of course, exacerbated further by inflation at this moment. Yeah. Fossil fuel, in particular coal, is coming back. So if you look at Europe, the latest European Parliament voted to get a natural gas and the nuclear into the taxonomy, access to green investment. If you look at the U.S., latest Supreme Court's ruling, of this particular case, West Virginia versus, just the EPA, literally challenging the executive branches, meaning the White House and the ministries or departments there, in terms of regulating existing power sectors emissions control. So it's very complicated. Back to the point, the why we're talking about it here today. China has so much to celebrate. Really persisted on in this very difficult situation, continue to advance, deploy market-based instruments.
Mr. Mailing, it's no secret the last climate change conference did not work very well. Mainly people are just talk about it and without really reaching much consensus. Now we see also, for example, where you are in the U.S., the president making a trip in the Middle East, namely just to try to get more oil on the shopping list. Now, circumstances are changing so much. How do you see the nature of debate now regarding carbon trading, carbon market, and related items?
Over the last several years, I feel like the sort of broader debate about carbon pricing, including carbon trading markets, has been quite favorable. And there's a lot of momentum in that. And some international bodies like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the OECD, et cetera, are all sort of trying to advance and progress this. And I speak with officials and governments in many developing countries and emerging economies, say Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, et cetera. All of them are motivated to accelerate their deployment of carbon pricing. One reason for that, and it's a controversial one, of course, is that some countries like the US or jurisdictions like the European Union are considering carbon tariffs, which will consider and reward, if you like, if other countries have carbon pricing systems. But if they do not have carbon pricing systems, their products will have to pay the full carbon price when they export those products to, say, the European Union. So that has really sort of accelerated, I think, the debate, but it remains complex and controversial, as you say.
Mr. Zhang, as all our panelists illustrated, there are various reasons why people discuss, implement, and also work further on carbon issues, including China. Tell me more about what do you consider now as the fundamental logic in China's current determination to work on the carbon issue and the current, shall I say, fundamental logic why carbon market is so much crucial for this country?
We're in a transition, right? We all agree that carbon neutrality needs to be achieved by 2050 or so. I think nobody disputes about it. I think the disagreement is about the current immediate action, that how much, and how more that we should take. And basically, in this transformation, you need money, right? And apparently, the taxpayer money, the public fund is not going to be sufficient. You need private money to go into every corner, every possible solution that you can find to help facilitate this transformation. How we'll be able to incentivize the private fund to go into this? Well, you need some kind of measurement, and I cannot think about a better measurement than the carbon market, than the carbon pricing. A more predictable sort of carbon pricing gives the strongest and the most assuring signal to lure the investment from the private sector to participate into this transformation. And that just really, I think I see the fundamental logic in addition to many of the other benefits that you would get from the establishment of the carbon market. And I think Chinese government has really thought this through. And if you examine, lots of recent actions by the central bank, by the Ministry of Finance, green finance, carbon finance, sort of the green investment taxonomy, all of them, they all go back to this very fundamental thing, which is put the price on carbon.
But how about the measures that you said that has been taking place in China? Ms. Wu, you've been living both in the U.S. and China over the years. Could you help us to understand what's your assessment, whether it's a drop of water in the sea or it is a fundamental change that we are seeing both in policies and in mentalities?
Policy incentives are crucial in terms of, we call it a push and a pull. On one side, we need to reduce emissions, and we set up targets already over the next few decades. And in the meantime, we need to, to really create incentives to attract investment into clean technology. And in that process, of course, it's not just reduce emissions, but also fundamentally transforming the energy structure, the industrial, the economy, the infrastructure, and other industrial sectors as well. So it is an integrated sort of strategy, but very importantly, carbon trading, we call it a market-based instrument, is one of the many policy tools that are proven and has its role to play. And at this moment of time for China, I think on one side, we do need to reduce emissions. We need a carbon market actually to help advance that process, but also it's playing a bigger role compared to maybe to Europe and other, US in particular. Such a policy tool, literally such a market mechanism is getting everyone's attention, particularly from companies, from bigger society, that everyone started to paying attention to carbon emissions so that incentives are on the table as well. Companies need to have the capability to comply. In the meantime, to learn through that process and trying to figure out how to really utilize such a market-based instrument policy tool to deploy, to advance or drive the clean energy transition.
There are a lot of practical issues that needs to be figured out, Mr. Melling, when it comes to carbon trading. First of all, how much carbon actually has been consumed by different, let's just say, production entities, how to assess that, and who is going to give a precise number, and how to see the price of trading of carbon, and how it should be adjusted. All of these are technical issues, and yet all these details are crucial for the success of this carbon trading scheme in China. Your thoughts?
I think you're right. It's technically complex and there is a steep learning curve, But I know China has been working on this, studying and learning for well over a decade. I remember when I did some of the earliest capacity building activities in China, in Beijing, one of the students had already written a whole book about emissions trading. So I was very impressed.
Can you still teach that course to him or her at that time? Or the other way around?
Well, we had good debates. Let's put it like that. Really great discussion. But so the technical aspects, they can take time to learn and perfect and fine tune. Europe is still working on some of its kinks. It's never fully, completely perfect. You know, one always has to prove, but those can be resolved. The politics are often the more difficult aspect. If you want to get new sectors in, sectors that are, let's say, very competitive, compete in world markets, and they say, like, if you include us, we will lose competitiveness, we will lose jobs, we will lose production and sales, etc., market share. That is the more complicated thing. And you know, I think China has been moving very fast compared to some other jurisdictions in expanding and starting to tell new sectors, you will be included, so prepare for this system.
Ms. Wu Ying, please, also your thoughts on this.
Certainly. I think that China has very effectively, both through this first year of national operations and through the pilot systems that preceded it, created the foundation for a really impactful carbon market program. And by that, I mean that it has given experience not just to the covered companies themselves, but to the regulators and to the traders and how to manage this system. The challenge now will become ratcheting up the demands on those covered companies that exist in the power sector today and that will exist in industrial sectors tomorrow, and to make the different prices that they will be paying for their carbon emissions allowances higher, to make the levels that they have to reduce their emissions more ambitious, and that as that happens, we will see this kind of policy instrument become a real pillar of China's broader carbon neutrality goals, and ultimately be tied to those goals in future 5-year plans, in 2030 peaking plans, in mid-century carbon neutrality plans, and the like. But it will require some pain in the sense of making those kinds of regulations a bit stronger as it moves along. And I think that that's always been the plan by Chinese regulators, is to build that foundation first, to build that capacity, and then gradually increase what's being asked of those that are covered by it.
Let's talk about those pains, especially now, Ms. Wu. As you know, we want to look at the long term, but the short term also very important for laying the foundation, as well as building people's confidence and interest in the cause. So the short term, economic difficulties, post-pandemic recovery is top on the agenda of everyone, with the strict policy regarding the prevention and control of COVID-19. We see Chinese businesses are trying to struggle back on their feet again. And but this is a very strenuous process. At the same time, they understand that carbon and also the future greener, more sustainable is the way to go, is going to be the future. And yet, that means grand transformation of their business models and the way of doing things. Now, how do you see people are balancing these two, or probably even more complexities, all at the same time?
Short term, it's really a struggling process. You know, if you look at the system shocks, the wars in Europe, the energy shortages, energy security concerns, COVID. So you started to see in reality, one, fossil fuels coming back, particularly coal, right? And with all the carbon market, with all the committed targets, decarbonization, we're supposed to phase down or phase out coal down the future, but somehow it's now basically phasing up. So that's a realistic challenge, because we need to address energy security issues there. People need heating, cooling, cooking, whatever. The second reflection, I think, is really the struggling industries. And that's why you started to see more resistance on the ground from industries, because most of them are struggling with all the issues, the cost of the energies, lockdowns, you know, disruption of supply chains, everything like that. So when they are struggling in terms of survival sort of mood, it's very difficult actually for them to be sort of willingly, right, and to embrace carbon market or price on carbon there at this moment. But in the meantime, I think the country, the government, regulators, business, the society overall are fully aware of what's coming up, right? In the short term, a little bit beyond the short term is that climate change is intensifying. We are living in it. The costs are rising in terms of losses of lives, properties, disasters. In the meantime, if you look at the EU, so EU Parliament made a decision. This is sort of a border tax, import tax actually down the road, and now is set around probably 2026. So for Chinese industries, they know very well if they want to capture being part of the global market, particularly selling to Europe, they had to get ready, right? They had to prepare. So this is sort of a short-term, immediately, sort of at this moment, it's really struggling process. Companies are concerned about their survival as well as their competitiveness at this moment, but they know very well it's coming. It's there, it's on the horizon. Somehow they still have to figure out how to carry on.
Mr. Zhang?
Well, I think there's really two aspects. I think one is, I think we're so lucky that throughout the process, actually, I'm featuring that in my news that will be launching tonight, literally here in Wuhan, on the journey that we have gone through for building the carbon market. The Chinese government made a wise decision, choosing the carbon market instead of carbon tax. And you cannot imagine how we're going to be able to deal with the carbon tax if we had that earlier, given all the uncertainties and this economic disturbance. And I think that really demonstrates the resilience of this instrument that really help us to go through. And I think the other point is that was also in the details, and that also in the creativeness and the smartness of the people who design it. I'll give you one example, that in order to cope with the sudden drop of the production activity in the first year of the COVID, what the Chinese government has done is they actually combined the first year, 2019 and 2020, together as the first compliance period instead of just focusing on 1 year. And I think that has very materially and effectively, smoothed out the uncertainty in the emissions level because of the shock wave from the COVID.
Mr. Irwin, how do you see both the competition and the cooperation, shall we say, among economies, for example, China, US, China, EU, and etc., will be able to work on the carbon reduction costs and through particularly the carbon trading market, a tool like that?
Well, it's worth noting again some modest success here, which was agreement at the most recent United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the Parties for some rules to manage how carbon markets can operate effectively internationally. That's something that we've been working toward for several years and will enable some greater flexibility and some opportunity for collaboration. For example, if we have a country that is paying for an emissions reduction in another country and yielding an offset credit for that, they will be able to report that credit out in their national emissions inventories, which they declare to the rest of the international community, and do so with everyone's understanding that that emissions reduction is real, that it is only being counted once, and that it represents some actual progress toward our collective climate change goals. That sounds simple enough, but in practice can become a fairly complex endeavor. And so it has taken some time to hammer out the appropriate rules, regulations, norms, and systems that can facilitate that. We'll also see on the competitive side what Dr. Mailing referenced earlier, which is, I think, a growing intersection of international trade and climate change considerations, illustrated most directly through potential tariffs and border adjustments on carbon-intensive goods that are being exported throughout different markets. This is at a fairly early phase, but is certainly already having effects, particularly on export dependent countries such as China and many others, which are already considering how these sorts of measures in destination markets that they depend on will affect their own calculations and their own bottom lines. As those instruments increase, we will likely see some adjustments in how countries are carbon pricing at home and how companies, in fact, are pricing carbon internally.
Yeah. Mr. Milling, on the one hand, we see the world's changing so fast, and the common aspiration to deal with climate change and the common actions for carbon reduction could be one of those fields for cooperation that is very much cherished and shared by a lot of people in China as well. So, but on the other hand, how do you see the real content of this cooperation? And how do you see the potential? Where is the potential?
One can see a trend, let's say, towards cooperation, learning from each other. And it's been going on for many, many years. Again, China studied carefully the experiences in Europe and California and in other jurisdictions to avoid mistakes and improve the system and make sure that it starts from an even better starting point than Europe started 10 years prior. That in itself sort of ensures that there is a growing, let's say, harmonization or convergence around system designs, around how to measure emissions, how to report emissions, et cetera. And then, of course, the cooperation under the United Nations Framework Convention, under the Paris Agreement, adds another sort of formal layer to that kind of convergence. Still, it is a tricky challenge. All in all, as we've been discussing throughout the last several minutes, there are many other concerns, many other priorities that can take precedence. But compared to, say, a decade ago, when we had the financial and economic crisis, I feel like climate policy and climate change have not just taken second seat as they did back then. There were some green industrial, a green revolution, green, et cetera, that did exist. But by and large, one could really see how climate sort of took a little bit of a breather and other concerns took precedence. This time, I have not seen any jurisdiction just say, we'll abandon climate, we'll put it on hold. All jurisdictions are moving. In some cases, some things like coal, et cetera, yes, in the short term, we see some setbacks, but by and large, I still see that momentum. And I think the appetite is there. And I think we see it in the G7, in the G20, et cetera, to make sure we don't give up on that. Even as we sort of start disagreeing on many other issues, not to start having these bifurcations on the climate topic.
Wu Changhua, Jackson Wuing, Michael Melling, and also Zhang Jianyu. Thank you so much for being with us. All the best. A discussion on carbon trading market in China, 1 year. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.